Great, thanks a lot, Melinda. So I think that we should raise a little bit the level of ambition of the title of this session, and not just how to disempower the aggressor. Let's talk about how to defeat the aggressor, okay? Let's set our sights a little higher than we than the conference title. So let me start with, I'm going to run through here a couple of different elements of the current conflict here with Russia and Ukraine. And I'll talk about the negotiations, I'll talk about sanctions and pressure, military capabilities, how to interact with citizens in the occupied territories, and then I'll talk a little bit about the broader picture, reforms, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to do this all in 7 minutes, I promise you, Melinda. So let me start with the negotiations. One of the biggest traps that we have fallen into in terms of the structure of the negotiations that take place on the conflict in the Donbass is that we have allowed Russia to use proxies to its advantage. And we have allowed Russia to create a structure in which the entire premise of the document, Minsk II, the February 15 agreement on a resolution of the conflict in the Donbass, is based on the premise that there is a civil war in Ukraine and that Russia is aiding the Ukrainian government in resolving this conflict by intervening with its good offices with the separatists in the Donbass. That is the premise under which Minsk II has been referred to in the international community by Russia. And unfortunately, it has been picked up in the structure of the negotiations. So the notion that you have this trilateral contact group, which includes representatives of Russia's proxy structures, has allowed Russia to hide behind these proxy elements and not to assume full responsibility for its actions in the Donbass. And, you know, of course, everyone in this room understands that's not the case. People in Washington and Brussels understand, and yet we have allowed the structure of the negotiations to be crafted in this way. And we need to move away from it, and we need to pin responsibility on Russia by structuring the negotiations in the right manner. And that means, first of all, we've also fallen into the trap of having the wrong people in the table speaking to Mr. Putin. So the Obama administration, and I was a part of the Obama administration, so you know, collectively I take blame for this, but made a terrible mistake when in Normandy they allowed for France and Germany to take the lead and essentially muscle Obama out of the negotiations between Presidents Putin and Poroshenko, and then effectively take the reins for the negotiations from there forward. People may forget, I know not in this room, but there was a previous format called the Geneva format that included the European Union, which of course is central to this conflict because Russia was objecting to the fact that Ukraine dared to have the goal of joining one day the European Union and pursuing an association agreement and a free trade agreement with the Europeans. They were muscled out, and the United States was muscled out. And instead we got this kabuki set of discussions between previously Hollande, now Macron, Chancellor Merkel, and Ukrainian and Russian presidents, with the US aside from the process. A bilateral conversation, with all due respect to Kurt Volker, who's a wonderful person, a friend of mine, and a very accomplished diplomat, a discussion between Kurt and Mr. Surkov is no substitute for having the US at the highest level at the table in these negotiations, putting pressure on Russia to implement not just the terms of what was put on paper in Minsk either in September of 2014 or in February of 2015, but fundamentally to get its troops out of the Donbass, to remove its weapons and return control of the border to Ukraine. So that's the negotiations. How do you get there? Well, in order to get there, you have to think about the types of pressure that can be applied to Russia. Now, I think sanctions have been useful. They are the correct asymmetric tool because the West is not going to get militarily involved in the conflict in the Donbass or in Crimea. So they are one of several tools that should be used. but they have been vastly underutilized. We have applied so-called sectoral sanctions against the against the financial, the defense, and the energy sectors of Russia. But this is a misnomer. These are not sectoral sanctions. These do not target the entire Russian energy industry. They target a narrow spectrum of upstream development within the energy sector. Similarly, within the defense sector, they target a narrow subset of entities that are engaged in defense. In the financial sector, we do not have what are called blocking sanctions on any Russian entities except for Bank Rossiya, which last time I checked was about the 26th largest bank in Russia. Well, excuse me, there is a bank called Sberbank, there is a bank called VTB, there is a bank called Gazprom Bank that are there to be sanctioned. And the United States can do this unilaterally. We do not need the European Union to do this because these banks all transact in dollars. So, my analogy is if the sanctions dial on Iran, when we implemented tough multilateral sanctions on Iran, was an 8 or 9 out of 10, what we've done to Russia right now is a 1 or 2. It's time to crank up the dial to 3 or 4 at a minimum, or more productively, to tell Russia that if it does not fulfill certain benchmarks by certain defined timelines, that there will be consequences in terms of sanctions. Okay, next, in terms of another tool for defeating the aggressor, clearly has to be building up Ukraine's military capabilities. Now, the last panel, and General Hodges talked a little bit about this, so I'm going to be very brief. Here, weapons are important, but providing arms by the United States, Javelin, anti-tank missiles, something I've long advocated, is great, but frankly, it's not going to be decisive. Far more important, in my view, is the military training program that is occurring right now, because this is teaching the Ukrainian military how to fight according to the standards that we have developed in the US military. And there's a lot more scope for taking this training further. So right now we are doing small unit tactics, which is kind of like elementary school. We can take this to the next level of doing combined arms training and more sophisticated types of operations. And we should do that. It will take time, and it will take money, and it will take resources. But then finally, most importantly, I think in the military sphere, we need to take a good hard look at Ukraine's defense industrial sector. This is an area where if the West and the United States and our partners partnered with the Ukrainian government to develop a roadmap to reform of the defense industrial sector, we could both attract enormous foreign direct investment into this country because the potential of this sector is enormous, but we could also have Ukraine producing the arms it needs to defend itself in the Donbass and as well generate revenue by exporting weapons to outside markets. But here is the catch. To do this, you cannot have the levels, the astronomical levels of corruption that currently exist in this sector. When I was in the Pentagon, talked to U.S. defense corporations, large and small, including Fortune 50, Fortune 25 companies. They will not touch Ukraine. They will not invest 1 penny in Ukraine so long as this sector remains as corrupt as it is today. So, talk about disempowering the aggressor. You need to start by tackling corruption in this sector. As my friend Glenn Howard mentioned in the previous panel, it's time to think about getting rid of UkrOboronProm and putting in place a structure where the regulatory functions are stripped out and there is a true competitive defense industry in Ukraine. That is in your interest over the long term. In terms of dealing with citizens in the occupied territories, this is a tricky matter. They are citizens of Ukraine, and Ukraine has obligations to them, especially those that do not choose to remain, but they are pensioners, they have houses, they have livelihoods in the occupied territories. And yet, at the same time, Ukraine must not empower the mafia thugs who control the occupied territories by providing services that are a proxy for their inability to provide services. So this is a tricky matter. My own view is that it is perfectly legitimate to cut off patterns of trade that support the proxy regimes, but patterns of trade with, for example, between Ukraine and Russia, as long as they do not benefit the defense sector in Russia, but if they are simply private trade between entities on the two sides of the border, I think I have less of a problem with that. Lastly, I will talk a little bit about the bigger picture of Ukrainian reforms, because I think as a number of the previous panelists have discussed, this is really the essence to defeating Russia over the long term. If Ukraine fails to pursue reforms vigorously, no, let me rephrase that. Ukraine is pursuing reforms. You've done pension reform, you've done healthcare reform, you've done a number of reforms. I'm going to be really, really blunt with you. None of this is going to matter if corruption keeps clawing its way back to Yanukovych era levels the way it is right now. Ukraine needs to tackle the cancer of corruption, and it needs to do it immediately, not just to sustain the support of the West. The support of the West is ancillary. It is important, but it's more important because this is the method that Putin has chosen to use to destabilize not just Ukraine, but all of Western societies. He has doubled down on subversive tactics, using corruption, using energy supplies, using information warfare, using cyber. These are all subversive tools to be able to corrupt Western democracies, including NATO countries like my own country, the United States, from the inside. And if you provide the Kremlin with the ability to pour dirty money into your political system and affect political outcomes, then you will lose the fight. The gentleman in the last panel asked about whether Ukraine is winning or losing. You will lose if you don't get a handle on the endemic corruption that has paralyzed this country for the last 25 years. And, the West can help, and the West should apply greater conditionality, but at the end of the day, it's going to need to happen here within Ukraine. And I think I'm going to end on that somewhat pessimistic note, but one which requires a call to action.